The Young and the Restless spoilers shock. Kyle Abbott found himself spiraling into one of the darkest periods of his adult life, and it was not simply because of his volatile relationship with Claire Newman, though that was certainly at the center of the storm. For weeks, there had been a tension simmering between them, subtle cracks forming beneath the polished exterior of their romance. Kyle had envisioned stability, a chance to reclaim a piece of happiness after years of turbulent relationships, betrayals, and corporate wars that seemed to define his existence in Genoa City. Claire had represented a fresh start, someone untainted by the worst of his past and the weight of his last name. Yet, as the days unfolded, Claire began to feel trapped, as though the relationship was consuming her sense of individuality, and she yearned to make choices that reflected her own desires rather than Kyle's expectations. When she told him she needed space, Kyle was blindsided. He could not comprehend how someone who professed to love him could walk away so easily, but Claire's reasoning was firm: she needed to step back to rediscover herself. That alone would have been devastating enough, but what twisted the knife deeper was the knowledge that Holden Novak was waiting in the wings. Kyle could not ignore the timing, nor the fact that Holden had extended an invitation to Claire to join him in Los Angeles. It was not just a casual suggestion, it was a proposition that carried with it the promise of new beginnings, adventure, and the intoxicating allure of shared ambition. For Kyle, it was impossible not to see it as betrayal dressed up in noble language about independence and self-discovery. The idea of Claire boarding a plane to Los Angeles, choosing Holden's company over his, gnawed at Kyle until it became unbearable. He began questioning everything: her motivations, her words, the sincerity of her love. Had she ever truly been committed, or had Holden always been there as an unspoken temptation? In Genoa City, whispers carried quickly, and Kyle soon learned that Claire had indeed accepted Holden's offer. That confirmation crushed him, stripping away what little hope he clung to. He replayed every recent conversation in his mind, searching for signs he missed, gestures that should have warned him she was slipping away. Instead of answers, he found himself drowning in self-doubt and humiliation. The powerful Abbott name, the privilege, the business acumen, it suddenly meant nothing when faced with the image of Claire and Holden together under the bright lights of Los Angeles. In the aftermath of her departure, Kyle drifted aimlessly, unable to focus on family obligations or corporate responsibilities. The walls of the Abbott mansion, once a place of refuge, now felt suffocating, reminders of expectations he was failing to meet. Seeking escape, he returned to the jazz lounge, the very place where he had recently lost control in a drunken haze. That night had been a warning of what could happen when pain met intoxication, but Kyle ignored the lesson. The need to numb himself was stronger than his better judgment, so he drank again, harder, longer, with reckless abandon. Patrons cast uneasy glances as the heir to one of Genoa City's most powerful families slurred his words, stumbled across the floor, and drowned shot after shot in a desperate bid to silence the ache inside him. What made this night different was not just the volume of alcohol, but the sense of abandon that clung to him. Kyle no longer cared who saw, who judged, who whispered about his downfall. By the time he left the club, his vision was blurred, his steps unsteady, his heart pounding with a toxic cocktail of anger and despair. He barely remembered how he got back to his suite, only that the night was a blur of taxi rides, muffled conversations, and the sensation of collapsing onto his bed. Darkness took him quickly, mercifully, but when morning light crept through the curtains, Kyle's nightmare was only beginning. He stirred with a pounding headache, his mouth dry, his stomach churning. At first, he thought the room was empty, that he was alone with the crushing consequences of his choices. But then he sensed movement, a shift in the sheets beside him. Panic surged as he turned his head and found himself staring at an unfamiliar face, a woman lying next to him, breathtaking in appearance yet utterly foreign to his world. Her presence was like a thunderclap in the quiet of morning, jolting him fully awake. For a moment, he convinced himself it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of his alcohol-soaked brain. But as she stirred, as her eyes opened and met his, reality came crashing down. Kyle's mind raced, replaying fragments of the previous night that refused to align into a coherent story. Who was she? How had she ended up here? What had he done? Fear tangled with shame, dread mixing with disbelief. He thought of Claire, of how quickly she would hear of this, of how Holden might use it as ammunition to paint Kyle as reckless and unworthy. His family, too, would inevitably find out. The Abbotts prided themselves on resilience, on weathering scandals with a certain dignity, but this was different. This was not a calculated risk or a business blunder, it was raw, messy, and personal. As Kyle sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, he realized that he had reached a crossroads. His choices had led him to this moment of horror, and there was no undoing it. The woman beside him represented more than a one-night mistake, she was a symbol of how far he had fallen, how desperate he had been to escape his pain. Whether she would become a complication in his future or simply a ghost of a night gone wrong remained to be seen, but the damage to his self-respect was already done. For Kyle, the weight of Claire's departure had driven him to the brink, but waking up in that bed reminded him that his actions had consequences far beyond heartbreak. It was not Holden or Claire who defined his downfall, it was his inability to face loss with strength instead of surrendering to weakness. In that moment, Kyle Abbott, heir to legacy and power, felt smaller than he ever had before, consumed by regret, fear, and the terrifying knowledge that his life had just veered into a darker, more dangerous chapter. Kyle Abbott's spiral did not occur in isolation, nor was it a one-night slip that could be dismissed and swept away with apologies. In Genoa City, everything was interconnected, each relationship brushing up against another until the threads of fate tied people together in ways they could never fully escape. Claire's departure and Holden Novak's shadow had already destabilized Kyle's fragile state of mind, but what came next would push him further into chaos, and ironically, it was someone equally damaged who became his companion in destruction, Audra Charles. Audra had spent months presenting herself as the ultimate power player, a woman who could control situations, manipulate outcomes, and bend people to her will. She had maneuvered her way through corporate ladders, tangled with dangerous alliances, and used her allure as both weapon and shield. But beneath that polished armor was a woman who craved validation, who longed for stability and a love she could not manufacture with scheming. Her eyes had turned back to Nate Hastings, a man whose quiet strength and moral compass represented the very thing she had convinced herself she didn't need but secretly desired. Yet when she finally lowered her guard, when she decided to appeal to him not as a strategist but as a woman yearning for a second chance, Nate delivered the cruelest blow, rejection. That refusal shattered something inside Audra, a breaking point she hadn't anticipated. Rejection was not foreign to her, but hearing it from Nate, the man she believed might still see her worth, cut deeper than she expected. Pride kept her upright in public, her usual sharp tongue warding off any perception of vulnerability. But behind closed doors, she turned to the same poison Kyle had been drowning in, alcohol. Both of them, wounded in different ways yet eerily similar in their desperation, found themselves in the same orbit on a night when their defenses were gone and their rage simmered too close to the surface. At the jazz lounge, Kyle sat brooding at the bar, drink in hand, the world spinning around him without meaning. Audra entered like a storm, her presence commanding attention even in her unsteadiness. She ordered a drink, then another, her sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. There was a mutual recognition, not of friendship or kinship, but of shared ruin. Their conversation was jagged, cutting, fueled by bitterness. Kyle mocked her failures, Audra prodded at his heartbreak, each lashing out because the pain inside needed somewhere to go. Yet under the surface of that animosity was an undeniable charge, the kind that exists between two people who despise one another but can't deny the magnetism of proximity. Drinks blurred boundaries, insults became sparks, and what should have ended in another shouting match instead escalated into something neither could later explain. They stumbled from the lounge together, anger twisting into reckless passion, and by the time the night ended, the lines between fury and desire had vanished. Morning light, however, brought no comfort. Kyle woke with the same splitting headache as before, but this time the horror that awaited him was not an unfamiliar stranger, it was Audra Charles. The sight of her lying beside him was like ice water thrown over his already fragile state. shame clawed at his chest as memories of the night flickered in fragments, shouts, touches, doors slamming, lips colliding in a blur of intoxicated impulse. He wanted to believe none of it was real, that it was a cruel hallucination conjured by whiskey and despair, but Audra's presence was undeniable. She stirred, half smirking even in her own haze, a woman who wore chaos like perfume. For her, the night may have been just another chapter in a string of dangerous liaisons, but for Kyle, it was catastrophic. Even if a part of him had acknowledged her beauty in a drunken daze, sobriety brought with it nothing but revulsion. He loathed Audra, not just for her manipulations in the past but for what she represented now, his weakness, his surrender, his betrayal of himself and the slim hope he still nurtured of reconciliation with Claire. Technically, he was single, Claire had walked away, and he owed her no vows. But Kyle's heart still belonged to her, and the knowledge that she could one day learn of this night with Audra gnawed at him relentlessly. He imagined the disdain in Claire's eyes, the cold dismissal she would deliver if she discovered he had sought solace in the arms of a woman she would never trust. Audra, for her part, was no savior in this mess. If anything, she seemed almost amused by his horror, the kind of amusement that came from knowing she had dragged him into the mud alongside her. Perhaps she was just as broken as he was, reaching for comfort in the most self-destructive way possible, but Kyle could not shake the feeling that he had been manipulated, even in his drunken state. He feared what she might do with the knowledge of their night together, whether she would wield it as leverage, twist it into a weapon, or simply let it slip into Genoa City's gossip mill, where it would inevitably find its way back to Clare. The weight of regret settled heavy on Kyle's chest as he pulled himself from the bed, unable to even glance back at Audra. Every instinct in him screamed to escape, to bury the night so deeply that it would never surface again. But in a town like Genoa City, secrets never stayed buried. He knew this truth too well, for the Abbotts and Newmans alike thrived on exposing hidden sins, and sooner or later, this one would come to light. Worse still, Kyle realized that this was not just about Claire, or about a mistake in judgment. It was about the man he was becoming. Each reckless night, each desperate attempt to drown his pain, was transforming him into someone he no longer recognized. The horror of waking up next to Audra was not just about who she was, but about who he was in that moment, a man willing to throw away his dignity, his self-respect, and perhaps even his future, all because he could not cope with heartbreak. The thought of facing his family, of enduring Jack's disappointment or Summer's judgment, was unbearable. Yet even more unbearable was the thought of facing himself in the mirror and knowing he had crossed a line that would haunt him long after the hangover faded.